Okay, so you studied my website a little bit about um, Pacific Islanders. Did you have any questions about that?
Yeah, so my first question was, as I was reading through it, you're talking a lot about misconceptions that people have, and I was just wondering what the life in the Pacific Islands is like today. And in my mind, I kind of picture it as an underdeveloped culture, but reading your website, I'm sure that's probably incorrect.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I thought too when I first started learning about it. I thought of like grass skirts and just like spearfishing and just kind of savages. And as I studied it a little more, I just learned that people in the Pacific Islands are really just people. Their countries are developed. They drive cars. They have regular jobs. They're just regular people. They're advanced. They're intelligent. They're just
Right.
basically like us. So
Makes sense.
yeah, I mean they do hold on to their culture. I learned that they have like their tribal tattoos, and a lot of them will still get those tattoos just as a way to retain the culture, and they still do have like their dances, and they do hulas and luau's and stuff, but that's not strictly all they do.
It's just during like ceremonies or
yeah.
Okay, celebrations. Okay, I had another question. So I was reading through, and there was a segment that was talking about how the way they dealt with their chiefs' bodies after they had died, and I was just wondering how their government is now. Did they still have chiefs, or how is their government run?
I can't speak for all the Pacific Islands, but I do know that Tonga is a monarchy, and so there's a king, and the king will appoint a prime minister. So
interesting.
Yeah, I only know about Tonga though, but I'm sure that a lot of the Pacific Islands are similar, and there are probably some that are different too.
Right.
And I'm sure there are some that have chiefs as just part of a tradition, or
yeah,
just different. I'm not exactly sure, but
okay, perfect. And then another question that I had was, you talk a lot about this misconception that people have called the model minority myth. And I actually thought it was really interesting when I was reading it, because what the model minority myth is that people see one portion of this culture and they see that there's success, and so they assume that everyone else has success. And the problem with that is that other people that might be suffering within that culture aren't getting the adequate help that they need because they're being overlooked. Which I thought that was interesting, because I'm a victim of that. I know a lot of Polynesians, and they're very well off, and so I just assumed that everyone was doing fine. So I was just wondering if there was a plan to correct that.
So I actually had the same opinion too. I noticed that when I first started looking more into Pacific Islanders, and I realized that the Polynesians that I know are just, I just look at them, they're my friends, they seem just like regular, they seem like they're doing well. And the damaging thing is about the model minority myth is that there are Pacific Islanders who are struggling. They're struggling with getting housing. They can struggle with schooling, and that extends to college. They don't get the financial aid that they need because they are just overlooked, and they're not seen as people who might need assistance. So that's a big problem with the model minority stereotype. And some ways that I have tried to come up with or thought about with individually and with my group is that you need to be educated. I feel like as individuals we should be educated, and that we should raise awareness for for governments, and especially in the United States. And
So be educated myself, and then also raise awareness so that other people can be educated.
Right, and we've
Okay,
talked
that
about
makes
having
sense.
like there are cultural kind of cultural museums or whatever, you know what I mean, and
Mhm.
or visitor centers. We talked about having visitor centers and maybe having Pacific Island Awareness Month, sort of. So one thing we talked about is that there's a lot of times Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans are lumped together as one, and they're not the same at all. And so that's um, part of the reason that this happens, and that's part of the problem, is that they're lumped together with a completely different ethnicity, and they're not given their own help. They're not given their own identities. And so another way to resolve that is to start seeing them as their own culture and their own ethnicity instead of lumping them together with Asian Americans.
Mhm.
So that's
That makes sense.
yeah, that's one way to kind of curb that a little bit.
Cool.
And then, did you have a third question, or was that
That was
the third
I'm
question?
pretty sure.
Okay? So, oh,
We even started it. Okay, we're at 7 minutes.
Okay. So, sorry.
No, it's okay. Oh,
Did you have anything that you were?
I had an idea when you were talking about the problems. Maybe like media. Media could be a good way to spread that.
Yeah, that's actually really true, and that actually goes really well with the Matrix of Domination.
Mhm.
And the Matrix of Domination is just this idea of the definition is corresponding systems of inequality, such as race and class, that are interconnected. So there are all these different systems that contribute to inequality in different ethnicities. And these are education, media, crime, family, health, and housing. And one way that the media kind of fits into this is that it conveys dominant ideology and portrays distorted images of minority groups. And like we were talking about earlier, how you said that you kind of pictured Pacific Islanders as not as developed and not as advanced.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's portrayed in the media a lot.
Yeah.
And we still see them as just people who do the hula and who walk around in coconut bras and grass skirts.
Right.
And that can be really damaging to...
Well, that's interesting because media is so influential. And so what it's doing right now is seems like it's a negative influence on proper education of what Polynesian culture really is.
Mm-hmm.
When it has so much potential, if it was portrayed properly,
Mm-hmm.
to fix the very problem that's causing.
Yeah, exactly. It can cause a gap between, Pacific Islanders and other Americans. So, because when the only encounter that you've had with a Pacific Islander is through a TV screen, it can, cause you to maybe feel superior because of your advanced culture and your...
Right.
Yeah, so that's very true. And then some other ways, while we're talking about the Matrix of Domination, is housing. That's one that's hard for Pacific Islanders. And
Here, or
yeah, it's here. Yeah. What
Here?
do you mean? You mean like...
so is the housing problem a bigger issue after they've immigrated to a different country or within the islands?
I think it's a bigger problem when they've immigrated.
When they've left
Yeah.
the islands.
When they've left the islands, because they're more discriminated against. And
Okay.
one thing that I learned is that nearly 55% of Asian and Pacific Islander householders own their homes, and 45% were renters. And then I learned later that when Pacific Islander sought out a rental home or buying a home, they were real estate agents were much more likely to offer help with financing to white applicants than the Pacific Islander. So it's interesting that it's still a problem today, because I would never have expected that.
To be.
No. So, yeah, that's. And then, what do you think? Do you think that racism can be eliminated?
I think it can be. I think that it'll just take a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I think it's possible. And I also think with the effort and time, those two factors working together, I think eventually we can eliminate racism.
Right. And I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. I kind of thought that it could be. I've kind of gone back and forth on the issue. I almost feel like there's always going to be something that makes people feel like they're superior. There's always going to be a class of, you know what I mean, of people who think they're superior, yeah. And racism is just one way to do that.
I feel like, though, so obviously one issue is someone being brought up and told that, or someone conveying the message that they are superior to their children or through media.
Mm-hmm.
That would cause someone to feel superior. But I also feel like warnings, like such, just hashing out over and over of not feeling superior, I feel like that's also an issue, because growing up, like, where I'm from, like, well, I'm sure racism is an issue everywhere, but I don't feel like it really was within my family. And then, when you hear so much about not being racist, I didn't even realize...
It almost gives you a complex of...
Right. And so then I'm like, well, what's the problem? I didn't think there was a difference between... I didn't think there was levels of superiority or inferiority, but just being warned against it so much made me realize that it's there when I wasn't aware of it before.
Yeah. I think that's so true. It's almost like...
So you have to be careful with how much it's, like, preached about, I guess.
Yeah, just in general, how much it's preached about. Like, it's not good to be racist, but it's also not good to just, like, continually talk about it and talk about...
Not being racist, because that'll still create racism.
And yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay, so I hope you learned something from my website.
I did, thank you.
Okay, thank you for talking with me.